My father survived the war, but he died from it, slowly, silently, and 50 years too late. It wasn't a bullet that killed him, not a landmine, not an ambush in some forgotten jungle. It was something much quieter, something invisible. It lived in his throat for decades, coiled deep behind his voice, and by the time we realized it was there, it had already taken almost everything. The day it started, he said a word I'd never heard from him before, a word in Vietnamese, rung, the forest. He whispered it as they loaded him into the ambulance, his breath catching, eyes wide with something more than pain, something like fear or memory, or maybe both. It was strange, hearing that word from a man who had spent most of my life avoiding even the mention of the war, and now, in the moment between breath and collapse, it was the only word he could speak. I rode with him to the ER at the Houston VA hospital. The sirens blurred into a high-pitched tone in my ears. I sat across from him, watching his chest rise and fall in erratic rhythm, an oxygen mask strapped over his mouth. He kept trying to say something. His lips moved under the plastic, but the sound wouldn't come. The paramedic checked his pulse again. Pressure's dropping. Prep trauma too. He looked at me. He your father? I nodded. He served? Vietnam, I said. The paramedic grunted softly, like that explained everything. Agent Orange? I blinked. We don't know. He just looked at me. You will. When we got to the hospital, everything moved fast. Nurses pulled him onto a gurney, doctors shouting codes, pushing epinephrine, ordering scans. I stood outside the room, frozen. It wasn't the emergency that scared me. It was how calm he looked, like he had been waiting for this moment. The door swung open. A nurse stepped out and asked, "Is he allergic to anything?" I shook my head. She paused. "He keeps saying something, over and over." "What is it?" "Rung." I didn't answer. Couldn't. That word had followed him here, all the way from a jungle half a world away, and I had no idea what it meant to him, only that it terrified him more than the cancer eating through his throat. Hours passed. Eventually a doctor came out, a woman in her early 40s, kind eyes but sharp voice. "Your father has a mass in his nasopharynx, likely malignant. It's pressing against several nerves, affecting his speech and swallowing. We're running a biopsy now, but I need to be honest with you, this didn't just appear. It's been growing for a long time." I swallowed hard. "How long?" "Years, maybe decades." She handed me a clipboard. "VA records show some screenings, but nothing definitive. It's possible the damage was misattributed, especially with older vets." "Exposure history?" I hesitated. "He was in Quang Tri, twice. 1969, Marine Recon." She nodded slowly. "That's one of the heaviest spray zones." I felt cold. "Has he ever filed an Agent Orange claim?" "No, he never talked about it." She looked at me, then at the door behind her. "Maybe it's time someone did." I sat with him later that night. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed faintly. He was awake, barely. Tubes ran into his arm. His throat was bandaged where they had done a preliminary scope. He couldn't speak, but his eyes moved when I entered. I pulled the chair close. "You scared the hell out of me." He tried to smile. Only managed a twitch of the mouth. "They said it's a tumor. In your throat." No reaction. "They think it's from the war." His fingers moved, slowly, reaching for something. I handed him the whiteboard the nurse had left. With effort he wrote, "Too late now." I shook my head. "Not yet." He looked at me, really looked. And for the first time in years, I saw something in his face I didn't recognize. Not strength, not distance. Regret. He erased the board. Wrote again, "There's more." I leaned closer. "More?" He paused. Then wrote, "One letter at a time, DAVIS." Then he dropped the pen. Walter Barnes never talked about the war, not even once. Growing up, I had learned to stop asking. Every kid in the neighborhood had a dad who had some story, some wild tale from Da Nang or Hugh, a scar, a medal, a beer-fueled breakdown over July fireworks. But not my father. He kept his medals in a drawer he never opened. His uniform stayed sealed in a box in the attic, wrapped in plastic, untouched. And when people at the church or the post office thanked him for his service, he only nodded and said, "Was just doing my job," like it was a job at the post office, not a tour in Quang Tri. Our house always felt muted, not cold exactly, but distant, like something sacred had been buried beneath the floorboards and no one dared dig it up. He worked as a mechanic for most of his life, never owned a shop, never asked for a raise, just showed up, fixed what was broken, and left before anyone could ask too many questions. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't abusive. He just wasn't there, even when he was. As a kid, I thought he hated me. As a teenager, I was sure of it. But as an adult, I came to understand something much harder. He didn't hate me. He just didn't know how to be anymore. Not after the jungle. He never remarried after Mom left. That was in 1997, right around when I turned 16. She'd stayed longer than most women would have. Quiet tears at night. Fights that started over small things, unpaid bills, greasy footprints in the hall, but always ended with the same line, "You're not the man I married." He didn't argue, didn't beg, just stood in the doorway as she left, holding one suitcase and my childhood in her hand. After that, he cooked for himself, kept the house clean, read the paper at 6 a.m. sharp. He didn't watch the news. He didn't listen to music. The TV stayed off unless the Astros were playing. We spoke twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays. Same chair, same coffee mug, same unspoken tension. He'd ask about my job. I'd lie and say it was going well. I'd ask about his health. He'd lie and say he was fine. That's why when he started coughing, really coughing, I noticed. It wasn't like a cold. It was deep, raspy. And it didn't stop. He'd try to hide it with a hand over his mouth, but the shaking in his shoulders gave him away. At first, I chalked it up to age. 74, ex-smoker. Of course he'd cough. But then came the hoarseness. The missed calls, the way he started scribbling things on paper instead of speaking over the phone. "Voice is shot," he wrote one afternoon on a napkin at Denny's, "getting old." But it wasn't just age. His appetite faded. He pushed his eggs around on the plate. He lost weight, noticeable weight. His once strong shoulders began to curve in, as if the years were finally clawing their way through the muscle and memory. One Sunday, I offered to take him to the just to get checked out. He refused. "I've seen enough hospitals, just a scan. Dad, please." He looked at me, not angry, not dismissive, just tired. "I already know what it is." I blinked. "You do?" He sipped his coffee, then set it down with a quiet clink. "I've been waiting." Waiting? For what? He didn't answer, just stared out the window at the highway, eyes glassy, lips trembling slightly. That was when I saw it, the fear, not of death. Of something else. Of something coming back. I made the appointment myself. Didn't ask. Just told him we were going. The VA hospital in Houston hadn't changed in 20 years. Same gray hallways. Same peeling paint. Same line of weary men in faded baseball caps, their eyes empty from waiting. Waiting for test results, for paperwork, for someone to finally acknowledge what they went through. Walter didn't speak on the way there. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded, staring straight ahead like he was being marched somewhere. I tried to lighten the mood, cracked a joke about the Astros bullpen, but he didn't even flinch. The check-in nurse barely looked up. "Name? Walter Barnes," I said. She typed slowly. "Date of birth? May 22nd, 1949. More typing. "Symptoms?" I hesitated. Walter didn't. He leaned forward and rasped, voice gone. "Can't swallow. Hurts to eat." Her eyes flicked up. "Just for a second. Okay, you'll be in Bay 3. Ent's behind, but they'll see you as soon as they can." We sat for over an hour. Walter scribbled occasionally on a notepad I brought. Once he wrote, "They're not going to tell me anything I don't already know." Another time, this started a long time ago. Eventually, we were called back. The doctor was kind but distracted. Young. Too young. He asked questions, pressed gently on Walter's neck, looked into his throat with a small flashlight. There's some inflammation, vocal strain. You said this has been going on for how long?" Walter held up 2 fingers. 2 weeks? He shook his head, then wrote, 2 years. The doctor blinked. "And you didn't come in sooner?" Walter gave him a long, flat look. The doctor nodded, as if understanding, then moved on. "Could be chronic laryngitis, or polyps, could be something else." "You a smoker?" Walter nodded once. "Vietnam?" Again the nod. The doctor paused, then lowered his voice. "Any Agent Orange exposure?" Walter didn't answer. "I did. Yes. Quang Tri. 2 tours. He was Recon. In and out of areas no one wants to remember." The doctor leaned back slightly. He opened Walter's VA file on the tablet. "Well, looks like some notes from the 2000s. A referral for throat irritation. But, no follow-up?" He tapped the screen a few times. "They never did a full imaging scan?" "No," I said. He said they brushed it off. The doctor sighed. That wasn't uncommon back then. I felt my fists clench. "So what now? We'll start with a CT scan and a laryngoscopy." Then maybe a biopsy, depending on what we see. It could still be benign. He said that like it was a lifeline, but Walter didn't look relieved. He just stared down at the floor, jaw tight. Outside the clinic, Walter sat on a bench while I called work to cancel the rest of my day. When I hung up, I saw him scribbling something on the notepad again. He handed it to me. "Don't trust the results." I frowned. "Why not?" He stared straight ahead, then scribbled again. "They don't always tell the truth. The scans came back a week later. The ENT called me, not him. They didn't want to alarm the patient." I sat in my car, hand trembling as I took notes on the envelope in my lap. Suspicious mass in the nasopharynx, highly suggestive of squamous cell carcinoma. Moderate to advanced staging, possible lymph node involvement. Biopsy strongly recommended. I called Walter. He didn't pick up. I drove to his house, found him in the garage, wiping down a wrench that didn't need cleaning. I handed him the envelope. He opened it, read every word, didn't blink. After a moment he scribbled, "Finally." That was the word he used. Finally. Like it was something he'd been expecting. Something he had named long ago, and now it had simply arrived to claim what was due. He handed the paper back to me and walked into the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of medical pamphlets I didn't remember printing. VA cancer claims, Agent Orange-linked illnesses, veterans and delayed diagnoses. Every word made me angrier. How could they miss this? For years. How many times had my father come here with symptoms, only to be given antacids or lozenges? And how many others had walked in, already dying, while the system filed them under routine checkup? I opened my laptop and searched Agent Orange nasopharyngeal cancer. The results came fast. Multiple studies, dozens of anecdotal cases, denied claims, delayed approvals. Men just like Walter. Men who walked out of the jungle thinking they'd won, only to be killed decades later by something no bullet could stop. The official diagnosis came in a white envelope, stamped with the VA's seal, hand-delivered by a nurse who looked like she hated her job. Stage 3 nasopharyngeal carcinoma. It sounded clinical, distant, but in plain words, my father had cancer in the upper part of his throat, wrapped around nerves and glands that made eating, breathing, and speaking possible. It had grown slow, hidden, and now it was too big to ignore. The oncologist explained the plan with a kind of hopeful detachment. Radiation first, chemotherapy second, surgery if necessary, but unlikely. Too risky, too deep. The tumor sat like a parasite behind the soft palate, feeding on everything Walter never said out loud. He didn't flinch during the explanation. Didn't ask questions. He just nodded slowly, eyes locked on some fixed point on the beige wall behind the doctor. When they asked him to sign the consent forms, he didn't hesitate. He picked up the pen with a hand that barely trembled and signed in sharp, slow letters. Barnes, Walter J., just like that, like he was clocking in for a shift. The first radiation session lasted 20 minutes. I sat in the waiting room, pretending to read an outdated copy of National Geographic. When he came out, he didn't look different, just pale, eyes sunken, but the change had started. By the third session, he couldn't eat solid food. By the fifth, his voice was almost gone. It wasn't sudden. It faded like an old radio broadcast, losing strength by the day. First the gravel in his tone deepened, then consonants began to slur, and finally it dropped to a whisper so soft I had to lean in to catch even fragments. He hated the feeding tube, refused it at first, but when he lost 12 pounds in 2 weeks, the doctors insisted. He didn't argue, just looked away as they pushed the tube through his nose and down his throat, tears sliding from the corner of one eye. Not from pain, but from something else, something like shame. I started staying overnight at the hospital. The fold-out cot beside his bed became my new bed. I memorized the beep of the machines, the hiss of oxygen, the soft shuffle of nurses moving in and out like ghosts. He communicated mostly by writing now. The whiteboard had become a lifeline. Too much light. Feels like burning. I dreamed of Billy again. That last one made me stop. I asked, "Billy?" He nodded once. He never explained. One night, after his 7th session, I walked into the room and found him watching the window. Not looking out it, just watching it, as if something waited on the other side. I sat down. "You okay?" He didn't answer. I reached for the whiteboard, handed it to him. He stared at it for a long time, then finally wrote, "You were 5 when you asked me why I didn't talk about the war." I blinked. He wrote again. I said it was because I didn't remember. He turned the board toward me. I lied. I didn't know what to say. He erased it. Wrote, "I remember everything." Then he set the marker down and closed his eyes. The next morning, he couldn't write. His fingers wouldn't hold the pen. The nurses said it was a side effect. Temporary, maybe, nerve damage from radiation, but something about the look in his eyes told me it wasn't temporary. The whiteboard sat unused at the edge of his tray. I pulled up a chair and read aloud instead. Old articles, his VA files, the sports page. He didn't always react, but sometimes, if I paused long enough, he would nod. Once he reached out and squeezed my wrist. That was the day I brought the old cassette recorder from his house. I found it buried in a box in the attic, along with a stack of unlabeled tapes, some blank, some with dates written in Sharpie. One simply said, 1981. I didn't press play. Not yet, but I set the recorder beside his bed. He saw it, looked at me. I said, "When you're ready." He closed his eyes and nodded. The nightmares began after the second week of treatment. I'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of his breathing, sharp, ragged, uneven. Sometimes he'd be clutching the sheets, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if expecting it to collapse. Other times he'd be whispering things I couldn't understand, fragments of names, words in Vietnamese, the same word over and over. Rung, the forest. The nurses gave him mild sedatives, hoping to ease the trauma, but the dreams kept coming, louder, darker. One night he thrashed so violently they had to restrain him gently, whispering that he was safe, that the war was over. But for Walter Barnes, it had never ended. I started keeping a journal, not for myself, but for him. I'd write down anything he said, any movement or name he mouthed during those dream episodes. It felt intrusive at first, like I was stealing something private, but I also felt, deeply, that these were not just memories, they were unfinished business. The first time I wrote down a name, it was Billy. A nurse had asked him who Billy was. He didn't answer, but later, he reached for the whiteboard and slowly wrote, Quang Tri, 1969. I brought it up to him the next day. I asked gently, "Was Billy someone you knew there?" He didn't respond. I pressed, "Was he part of your unit?" Still no response. Then quietly he looked at me, and for the first time in days, his lips moved without writing. "Gone." That was all he said. Just one word, like a stone thrown into a deep well. I spent the next afternoon researching old unit rosters. I went through stacks of old Marine records online, piecing together clues from the little I knew. Recon Unit, Central Vietnam, 1969. Operation Dewey Canyon. Then I found it. PFC William Billy Kesler, killed in action, February 17, 1969. Listed MIA for 3 weeks before his body was recovered. Served in the same recon company as Walter J. Barnes. My father had never mentioned him, never mentioned anyone. That night, I brought in a folder. I printed the casualty report and laid it on his lap. He looked down slowly. His eyes locked on the name, Kesler, William D. A long, painful breath escaped him. Then he leaned back in the bed and closed his eyes. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, just before I thought he'd fallen asleep, he reached for the recorder on the table. He clicked it on. There was no tape inside, just the quiet whir of old gears spinning. He held it for a while, resting it on his chest like it was something sacred. Then he mouthed a phrase. I leaned in close to hear it. I should have stayed. I didn't ask. I didn't push. But something had broken open. The next morning, I returned with a new blank cassette and gently loaded it into the machine. I hit record and left it on the table beside him. "If you're ready," I said, "you can talk into it. Doesn't have to be for me." He didn't respond. But he didn't turn it off either. Later that night, I walked in and found the tape had run out. He handed it to me, shaking slightly. "Don't play it," he mouthed. "Not yet?" He shook his head. "Ever?" His eyes stayed on mine. And then he wrote, "Not until you know about Davis." Davis. A second name. A new thread. I added it to the journal, beneath Billy's. Walter seemed more alert the next day, weak but focused. He pointed to the whiteboard, and I handed it over. He wrote slowly, painfully, "Davis stayed behind." I asked what he meant. He didn't answer directly, just stared out the window. That night, he had the worst episode yet. He screamed in his sleep. Not words, just a raw, guttural sound that echoed off the sterile walls like it didn't belong in this time, in this place. The nurse rushed in. I held his shoulders, whispering that it was okay, that he was safe. But his eyes weren't in the room anymore. They were somewhere else. Somewhere humid and green and echoing with gunfire. The jungle had returned. After he calmed down, I sat beside him, holding his hand. And then I asked the question I'd been holding in my chest for days. Dad, what happened over there? He blinked slowly, then mouthed, barely audible, they didn't all make it. I nodded. I want to know, I said. I want to know everything. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since we'd started this awful journey, he looked like he was willing to tell me. Not today, not all at once. But soon I would hear the story that had killed his voice long before the cancer ever did. The jungle smelled like rot. It clung to your skin, your hair, your teeth. Even your breath tasted like wet leaves and something sourer underneath, something dead. February 1969. Quang Tri province. Just 10 miles from the DMZ, and every inch of it a death trap. Lance Corporal Walter Barnes gripped the foregrip of his M16 tighter as he moved through the underbrush. Sweat poured down his back beneath the flak jacket. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the forest still wept from its leaves. Everything was soaked. Everything made noise. They moved in single file. 6 men. Call sign Reaper 1. A recon unit with no backup, no support, just their wits and each other. Their mission was simple: track suspected Viet Cong movements along a narrow ridge near the river, mark potential trail activity, and report back by 0300. But nothing about this place was simple. Billy Kesler was directly behind Walter, light on his feet for someone carrying 50 pounds of gear. He was 19, from Ohio, and never stopped talking when they weren't under radio silence. He had a smile that looked out of place in war, like he hadn't quite accepted that joy didn't belong here. You think they know we're coming? Billy whispered. Walter shook his head but didn't speak. Not now, not when even breath could be too loud. Up ahead, Sergeant Davis raised a fist. Everyone froze. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It wasn't the quiet of birds or wind or insects. It was the silence of watching, like the trees themselves had eyes. Walter crouched low, scanning the tree line. His finger hovered near the trigger guard. Davis pointed left, 2 fingers. Walter and Billy, they split off, moving slowly, step by step, as if the ground could explode at any second. Billy leaned in. I don't like this. Walter didn't either. 20 yards in, they found it. A trail. Fresh boot prints. Vietnamese issue. 3, maybe 4 men. Moving north. Billy crouched to inspect them. They're light, no heavy gear. Scouts, maybe? Walter nodded, then he heard it a click. Billy, don't move. Billy froze mid-step, eyes wide. Walter looked down. Tripwire, tensioned, angled low against a root. Barely visible. Connected to a small rusted canister buried beneath the leaves. An anti-personnel mine. I swear to God, Billy whispered, his face draining of color. This can't be happening. Walter dropped to one knee. Don't shift your weight, he said quietly. Just breathe. Billy exhaled through his nose, his whole body trembling. Walter reached into his pouch for the wire cutters. His fingers were slick with sweat. The jungle pressed in around them like a vice. Easy, he said, voice low. I've got you. Billy didn't move, didn't blink. Walter reached forward and clipped the wire in one smooth motion. No explosion. Billy gasped. Oh my God. Shh, stay down. They moved back, inch by inch, until the mine was behind them, until the trees felt less like a coffin and more like just trees. Davis met them halfway. What was it? Bouncing Betty, Walter muttered. Tripwire. Davis nodded grimly. They're setting traps again. They know we're here. They huddled together in the clearing. The plan had changed. Too risky to stay out till 0300. Davis would send a coded burst and call for extraction before sundown. In the meantime, they'd hold position, defensive formation. Walter sat with his back to a tree, pulse still racing. Billy flopped down next to him, wiping his face with a filthy bandana. You ever defuse one of those before? Billy asked. Walter didn't answer. Billy chuckled, nervously. Jesus. That's 2 lives you've saved. I owe you a steak when we get back. Walter looked over at him. For a second, they weren't soldiers, just kids pretending to be men. Make it 2 steaks, Walter said. Billy grinned. That night it rained again, harder. The sky cracked with distant thunder. They had set up a cold camp. No fire, no talking, just radio silence and stifled thoughts. Walter couldn't sleep. He watched the rain trail down Billy's helmet as the younger man dozed in a makeshift poncho shelter. He thought of home, of his father's face, of the letter he never sent his mother. Then, out of the dark, came the sound. 1 shot, then another, then the screaming. The first bullet came from the tree line, sharp, fast, and deadly quiet until it wasn't. Then came the second, then the screaming. Davis yelled, "Contact, northwest!" Chaos exploded. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning caught in the trees. Gunfire cracked from all directions, echoing like thunder inside the thick canopy. Men dove for cover, returned fire blindly into the shadows. Walter's heart punched his ribs as he rolled behind a log, finger on the trigger, scanning, firing, moving, scanning again. Billy. He looked right. Billy was still crouched behind a tree 10 meters away, firing back. Steady hands, controlled bursts. Unnatural. Walter saw him peek from behind cover to reload. Then, a flash. A sound like a hammer hitting wet clay. And Billy fell. No. Walter bolted toward him, low to the ground, bullets snapping through the air. He dove beside Billy's body, flipped him over. The blood came fast. A bloom beneath his left shoulder, chest rising and falling in quick, jerking spasms. Stay with me, stay with me. Walter ripped open Billy's jacket, pressed down hard. Medic, medic, but they were too deep. No corpsman, no medevac. Just the jungle, and the kid from Ohio bleeding out in the mud. Billy's eyes locked on his. Hurts, he whispered, voice gurgling. I know. You're okay. You're okay, just stay awake. Tell. Davis, what? But Billy's mouth filled with blood before he could answer. His eyes drifted. No, 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 no. Walter slapped his cheek. Billy, Billy, look at me. But the light was already leaving. His chest slowed, stopped. Walter pressed harder. Come on, but nothing, just the rain, and the quiet, and the war. Davis dragged Walter off the body seconds later. We have to move, now. Walter resisted. He's not, he's gone, Walt. We can't stay here. I can carry him. You carry him, we all die. Walter looked down at Billy. The mud had already begun to cover the blood. A gentle, obscene camouflage. He closed Billy's eyes with trembling fingers, stood up like his bones weighed 1,000 pounds, and followed Davis through the trees. They didn't stop until sunrise. When they reached the fire base, Walter didn't speak. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He sat on his cot for hours, replaying it, frame by frame, until the memory carved itself into him like shrapnel. They recovered Billy's body 3 weeks later. What was left of it? Official reports said Kia, during enemy contact, Quang Tri. But to Walter, that didn't cover it. It didn't cover the moment Billy looked at him, begging to live. It didn't cover the scream Walter never got out. It didn't cover the silence that came after. Back in the hospital, present day, Walter stared at the ceiling. David sat beside him, the old cassette recorder clutched in his lap. He hadn't played the tape yet. He didn't need to. He could see it on his father's face. The weight, the loss. The war he never spoke of had never ended. It had just changed locations. David whispered, Billy was your friend. Walter nodded. Did you ever tell his family? Walter's eyes closed slowly. A single tear slipped down. He mouthed no. David looked away, throat tight. Why not? Walter opened his eyes again, blinking with effort. Then he wrote, I left him. I lived, and beneath that, after a long pause, that was the war. The machines beside Walter's bed beeped slower now. The room smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and the kind of silence that made you feel like time had paused. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, like the jungle had finally drained all the color from him. The tumor was winning. He could no longer swallow. A feeding tube hung like a lifeline from his nose. His voice, what little was left, was reduced to soft gasps and occasional moans when the pain medicine wore thin. The doctors began talking in careful tones around me now, terms like quality of life, palliative management, and do not resuscitate. I ignored them. I stayed every night. I read to him from the journal I'd been keeping. I updated him on VA claims I filed on his behalf, documents stamped, faxes sent, emails unanswered. I showed him photos from the Billy Kesler archive online, digitized records, his boot camp graduation, a class photo with goofy smiles and buzz cuts. One day, when the sun broke through the blinds for the first time in a week, I walked into the room holding something unexpected, a letter. It was yellowed, brittle at the corners, written in the uneven scrawl of someone who'd never expected anyone else to read it. On the envelope, in faded blue ink, Walter J. Barnes, do not open unless I'm gone. D. Walter's eyes widened the moment he saw it. I sat beside him and placed it gently on the blanket. Who's Davis? He didn't answer, just stared. I opened the envelope and began to read aloud. January 5th, 1981, Walter. If you're reading this, it means I'm not around to tell you this face to face. That's probably for the best. You always were better with silence than with words. I want you to know, You didn't leave, Billy. I gave the order. I pulled you away. If there's any guilt to carry, it's mine, not yours. But I know you, and I know you've been carrying it anyway. I saw it in your face every time you looked at that damn photo of the 6 of us. You looked at it like it was a tombstone. But that's not why I'm writing. I'm writing because of what we did 3 days after Billy died. The thing no one ever put in a report. The thing they told us to forget. I know you remember, I do too. Every damn day I didn't write this to confess. I wrote it so you'd remember you weren't alone. That night, that ridge, we made a choice. I still don't know if it was the right one, but I need you to know, I would have made the same choice again. And I would have chosen you every time. You were the only one who kept your humanity out there. Even when the jungle tried to burn it out of you. If I'm gone, maybe you'll finally let yourself forgive. Or at least stop punishing yourself. Keep going, Walt. Don't let this thing rot you from the inside. You survived. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something sacred. Davis. When I finished reading, I looked over at Walter. Tears ran down the sides of his face, but his eyes weren't broken. They were wide, alert, focused. He motioned weakly toward the recorder on the table. I handed it to him. His fingers shook as he pressed record. He held it close to his chest and began to whisper. The cassette whirred softly as the old wheels turned. Walter clutched the recorder to his chest like a confession he had finally decided to make. His voice, what little was left, came out in harsh, broken whispers. It wasn't easy to understand, but I stayed silent, leaning in, letting him speak into the hum of the machine. He didn't look at me once. He stared at the ceiling, as if he was watching it all unfold again. 3 days after Billy. He paused, coughed, grimaced through the pain, then continued. We got orders, new intel. VC movement near Hill 314, North Ridge. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. Davis didn't want to go. He said we were stretched thin, tired, grief-drunk. But the brass wanted bodies on the ground. Recon, fast in, fast out. He clicked the pause button, rested for a long moment, then clicked again. They didn't tell us what else was on that hill. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the chair by the window, holding the cassette in my hand. I didn't play it. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and typed in Hill 314, Vietnam. Only a few results came back. Most were vague, unverified patrol accounts. One mention in a Marine Recon log. No public record of an engagement. No official battle. Just a blip on a map. A hill no one talked about. I wrote the number down in my journal. Then I flipped back to the letter from Davis. The thing no one ever put in a report. I reread that sentence 4 times. The next morning, Walter was already awake when I returned. He looked stronger, like the act of speaking had lifted something from his chest. I handed him a pen and the notebook. He scribbled slowly, play the tape later. Not here. I nodded. Where then? He wrote, at the house. In the garage. His eyes were sharp now, focused. I didn't ask why, I just promised I would. That afternoon, I left the hospital briefly and drove to his house. The garage was just as we'd left it. Dusty, silent, lined with old tools and parts from cars that hadn't run in years. I sat down at his workbench, placed the recorder on the table, hit play. His voice crackled through the speaker. There were 6 of us left by the time we reached the north slope. Hill 314 was quiet. Too quiet. We knew it. But we went anyway, because Davis said we had to. I closed my eyes, listening. We found the bodies 2 hours in. VC mostly, but not just VC. Civilians, farmers, kids. The word stabbed into me. No bullet wounds, just burns, scorched, like they'd been hit by something else. He paused. Then came the word that sent chills down my spine. Defoliant. He coughed. They sprayed that place, David. The trees were dead. The grass. It glowed under the moonlight. Another pause. Davis said to mark the area and pull back, but someone didn't agree. There was a long static silence on the tape. Then, that was the night we made a choice. The tape ended shortly after that. No explanation. No details. Just silence. Like even the machine was afraid to say what came next. I sat there for a long time, the recorder still in my hand, the quiet of the garage pressing in like jungle heat. Then I looked down and saw the corner of a photograph wedged between 2 drawers on the bench. I pulled it free. It was old, color faded. 6 men in muddy fatigues, faces young but tired, standing on a hill with scorched earth behind them. One of them was my father. Another I recognized from Davis's obituary. And the rest? I didn't know, but their eyes looked the same. like they had seen something they couldn't explain, or couldn't forgive. The jungle didn't smell the same on Hill 314. It didn't smell like rot, or sweat, or gunpowder. It smelled dead. Not the kind of death that came from battle, but something older, something chemical. The kind of stench that didn't just cling to your uniform, it soaked into your skin, your lungs, your memory. Walter moved carefully through the trees. The 5 other men behind him spread out in a tight formation. Davis led the team from the front, radio silence enforced. There was no sound but the wet crunch of boots and the soft rustle of scorched leaves underfoot. The trees were wrong here. No canopy, no birds. The jungle opened up like it had been scraped bare by something invisible. Tree trunks were gray and splintered, the ground blackened as if someone had tried to burn the forest but stopped halfway. They weren't supposed to be here. This zone had been marked non-operational on the maps, but intel said there was VC activity, a supply route maybe, or a base camp, so higher command sent them in to confirm or deny. Davis had argued, said the maps were wrong, said the chemicals dropped here a month earlier hadn't settled yet. Command didn't care. So they went. 15 minutes in, they found the first body. It wasn't a soldier. It was a boy. Maybe 12. Vietnamese, curled beneath a half-burnt banana leaf, skin blistered and split, eyes wide open in horror. No bullet holes, no blood, just damage, like his body had broken from the inside. Billy would have said something. Billy would have stopped and closed the boy's eyes, but Billy was gone. So Walter did it for him. Davis muttered, "Mark it. Keep moving." They pressed on. 10 minutes later, they found a woman. Same condition. Half buried in ash, her arms wrapped protectively around something, what looked like the skeleton of an infant. No enemy movement, no weapons, just ghosts. Walter's skin began to itch. It wasn't sweat. It wasn't bugs. It felt like something underneath his skin was shifting, like his cells were whispering, "We don't belong here." At 2,100 hours, they reached the ridge. The view was all wrong. Instead of thick jungle, they saw a wide stretch of open dirt and dying trees. A gray haze hovered low, moving like breath across the land. "Jesus," one of the men whispered. "What the hell did they drop here?" Walter stared at the horizon, then down at his boots. The soil was cracked and steaming. Even now, weeks after the last flyover, it still hissed like it hadn't finished dying. Suddenly, movement. To the east, Davis dropped low, hand raised. Everyone froze. Walter raised his rifle, sighted down the slope. Shapes, 3 of them, moving between the trees. Too fast for locals, too quiet for VC. Then a flicker of light. Muzzle flash. Shots rang out. Davis shouted, "Ambush, down!" The jungle erupted. Rifle fire tore through the clearing, dirt spraying, branches snapping. Walter dove behind a stump, returning fire, eyes scanning for targets he couldn't see. One of the men screamed. "Hit!" Walter crawled toward him, PFC Monroe, blood gushing from a leg wound. Before he could reach him, another explosion, close. Dirt and ash rained down, his ears rang. Then he saw Davis, still upright, firing in short bursts. "We're moving," Davis yelled. "Fall back, WEST." Walter grabbed Monroe by the collar, dragging him across the dirt. Another bullet ripped through the trees, nicking Walter's shoulder. He didn't feel it. All he could see was Davis turning to cover their retreat, firing until his magazine clicked empty. Then came the sound Walter would remember forever. Click. Davis reached for a fresh mag. Too late, a figure rose from the haze. Enemy rifle, point blank. Walter screamed, "Davis!" But the shot had already fired. Davis fell, hard, motionless. The silence after Davis fell was worse than the gunfire. It came like a void, swallowing the sound of birds, boots, even breath. Just wind and smoke and the ringing in Walter's ears. He stared at Davis's body, slumped forward, rifle still in hand, his helmet lying a few feet away in the blackened grass. He wanted to scream, but the jungle had stolen his voice. Monroe groaned beside him, blood soaking through his pant leg. They were pinned. Davis was gone. Command wasn't coming. Walter reached over, grabbed Monroe by his vest and heaved. They crawled backward through the underbrush, 1 foot, 1 breath, 1 desperate prayer at a time. He turned back once, saw the figure of Davis lying still, and kept moving. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach the edge of the zone. Their radios had been scrambled by interference, natural or otherwise, no one knew. When they finally broke through to a recovery patrol, the sun was rising. casting a pale orange over the ruined trees like a false hope. A Huey picked them up just after dawn. No one spoke during the flight. 3 men, of the 6 that had gone in. No one asked questions. The debrief was short. Walter wrote the report himself. He kept it clinical. Engaged enemy movement on Hill 314. Heavy resistance, 2 Kia, 1 WIA. Area confirmed as compromised. Possible chemical residue present. They never asked about civilians. They never mentioned the scorched earth, the way the trees glowed at night, the strange lesions forming on the back of Monroe's neck. They certainly never asked why Davis had gone down firing while everyone else ran. And Walter? He didn't volunteer the truth. He just folded up the memory like an old map and stuffed it into the deepest corner of himself. Back in the hospital, David sat beside his father, tears in his eyes. The tape recorder clicked off with a mechanical snap. Walter was too weak to hold it now, but his eyes were open, watching David, waiting. "You carried that," David whispered, "all this time." Walter blinked once. "You saw something out there that no one would name, and you buried it with Billy, with Davis." Walter nodded. David leaned forward. "It wasn't your fault." A long pause. Then Walter mouthed, "I left him." David shook his head. "No, you lived. That's what Davis wanted. That's what Billy wanted. If you hadn't, I wouldn't be here." Walter's eyes shimmered. Then he raised a trembling finger and pointed to the recorder. David understood. "It's time?" Walter nodded. David pressed record. This time the words were for Billy. "Billy, I'm sorry I never called your mother. I kept thinking I'd do it when I had something better to say, then I left him there. But there was never a better version. I think of your laugh, the way you said 2 steaks like it meant forever. Davis died trying to keep us alive. He knew something was wrong with that hill. We all did. We walked into poison, and we brought it home inside us. They called it exposure. I call it betrayal. But I'm tired of being angry. I just want to say your name out loud before I forget it. Billy Kesler, you mattered. We remember you. I remember you." David hit stop. Walter's eyes closed gently. He didn't move again for a long time, but the beeping on the monitor stayed steady. For now, Walter lasted another 29 days. Not that anyone expected that, not the doctors, not me, maybe not even him, but he held on, not to avoid death, but to finish something only he could finish. He stopped eating on the 12th day. The nurses said he wasn't in pain, not anymore. He slept more than he was awake, but every time I stepped into the room, his eyes would open, searching for me like he wasn't done being my father. I brought the recorder each day. Sometimes he would motion for it, sometimes not, but I always placed it near his chest, just in case. He said less and less, but he wrote more. The last full sentence he ever wrote was on a Thursday afternoon, in a shaky, smudged hand that took nearly 5 minutes to complete. "You were always braver than me." I didn't ask what he meant. I just sat there, trying not to cry, because he had no idea. A week before he died, I found the box. It was in the top of his closet, behind an old set of Marine Corps dress blues sealed in plastic. A cedar chest, unmarked, locked with a small brass clasp. The key was taped to the back, as if he'd always intended someone to find it. Inside were 3 things: a letter, a photograph, and a cassette labeled Final. The letter was addressed to me. I sat on the floor of his bedroom and read it under the weak light of a dusty lamp. "David, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Or I'm getting close. There's no right way to end a war. It just runs out of things to take from you. I didn't fight because I believed in politics or presidents. I fought because I had a job to do, and because Billy was next to me, and Davis, and the others. But when I came home, I brought something with me. Not just the nightmares, not just the guilt, something in my blood, in my bones. You know what it is now? They called it Agent Orange. I just called it the Second War. You've seen what it did to me. You've lived with the man it turned me into. I'm sorry. I wish I could have been a different father. I wish I'd talked. But now you have the words. You have the truth. You carry it now, and that's not a punishment. It's a torch. A damn heavy one. If you choose to share this story, do it right. Don't make me a hero. Don't clean me up. Just make me human. That's all I ever wanted to be again. Dad." I sat there for a long time. The photo was folded behind the letter. It was of my dad and Billy, shirtless, sitting in the back of a supply truck, grinning like fools, covered in dirt, sweat, and something like hope. On the back, written in Billy's handwriting, 2 steaks, no ketchup. I laughed. Then I cried harder than I ever had in my life. 3 days before he died, Walter stopped opening his eyes. He still responded to touch, to sound, to the soft hum of the cassette player on his nightstand. I sat beside him and played the final tape. On it, his voice was weak, but steady. To the men we left, I remember you. To the jungle, you didn't win. To my son, you broke the silence. And then silence. Not tape silence, real silence. Not empty, not heavy. Just complete. On the 29th day, just before sunrise, Walter took his last breath. I was holding his hand. There were no last words. No drama. Just peace. Like the jungle had finally let him go. The funeral was small, no military ceremony. He'd requested none. But I wore his dog tags under my shirt, and when the time came to speak, I stood in front of the pews and told the story not from the beginning, but from the middle. From Hill 314. From Billy, from the part where my father didn't run from death but from memory. And finally, toward the end, when he stopped running, I donated his tapes and letters to a veteran's archive. I made copies for the Kesler family. I found Billy's niece through a Facebook message chain that took weeks to piece together. She cried when I played the part of the tape where my father said Billy's name. She said it was the first time she'd ever heard his voice spoken by someone who knew him. I think that's when I realized my father hadn't died in silence. He had spoken. And now, others were listening. The day of the funeral was cold, but not cruel. The kind of weather where breath fogs in the morning air, but the sun still tries its best to break through. It was the kind of day my father used to call halfway weather, not quite winter, not quite spring. We buried Walter Barnes at Forest Hills Cemetery, just outside of Houston, Section 17, near a pond with 2 wooden benches and a weeping willow that had seen more tears than wind. He didn't want military honors, no bugles, no folded flags. I've had enough salutes, he once scribbled in the corner of his notebook, but a few old Marines showed up anyway. Not many, maybe 5. They didn't say much, just stood in quiet formation beside the casket. One of them, older than my father, with a scar on his jaw, laid a single can of W.L. Weller bourbon on top of the coffin before stepping back and giving a nod. I didn't ask how he knew. I think he just knew. I stood up to speak, though my legs felt like borrowed things. My voice shook for the first sentence, but it held. I want to tell you about the man most people didn't know. I paused, let the air settle. My father didn't talk much. Not about Vietnam, not about Agent Orange, not about guilt or nightmares, or the decades of silence that followed. Another breath. But he felt it, every day, in his body, in his blood, in the things he couldn't say to me until it was almost too late. Heads nodded. I want you to know that he wasn't a hero in the way Hollywood might paint him. He didn't save 1,000 men. He didn't storm a hill alone, but he carried something heavier than medals. I looked down at the casket. He carried memory, a pause, and eventually he chose to share it after the service. I stayed behind. The crowd trickled away. Family, nurses, the old Marines with quiet handshakes and lingering looks. Soon it was just me, and him, and the willow tree whispering in the wind. I sat on the bench, pulled out the small tape recorder, the same one he'd held in the hospital. I pressed play on the final track he'd recorded. His voice cracked through the speaker. David, if you're listening to this, it means you didn't walk away. I smiled. Of course I didn't, Dad. You stayed. You listened. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. He paused. Not my voice. Something deeper. Another pause. You reminded me who I was before the silence, before the war turned us all into shadows. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry I waited so long. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed when you needed one, but I never stopped being proud of you. Silence. Then faintly, and I hope you'll do something with this story, because it's not just mine. It belongs to Billy, to Davis, to the people who never came back, and the ones who did, but didn't come home. Click. End of tape. I didn't leave the bench for a while. I sat there with the old recorder in my hand, watching the pond ripple gently. The wind played in the trees. Somewhere, birds sang. The world kept moving, and for once, I felt ready to move with it. 3 months later, I stood in front of a podium again, this time at a veterans museum in Austin. The room was full. Younger vets, students, reporters, family members. I was giving a talk called The Voice That Came Home Late. At the end, I played a 2-minute clip from Walter's tape. When it finished, no one clapped. No one moved. It was better that way. It meant they were still listening. That night, the museum director asked if I'd be willing to help organize a traveling exhibit, something about memory, silence, and the chemical legacy of war. I said yes, because this wasn't just about my father. It was about every soldier who came back changed, every veteran who was told, "It's all in your head," while the chemicals killed them slowly from the inside out. It was about voice, and how powerful it is to finally use it. If you're hearing this story now, if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for honoring a man who thought no one would care. Thank you for holding space for a pain that lingered too long in the dark. And if you've ever loved someone who came home from war but never truly came back, this story is for you too. You're not alone. They're not alone. We carry them with us. Not just in memory, but in the way we live, the way we ask questions, the way we listen, and maybe, just maybe, the way we help them speak again. So now I ask you, have you ever known someone like Walter? Someone who never talked about what happened, but showed it in everything they didn't say? Leave a comment, share their name, tell their story. And if this moved you, if this reminded you of something or someone you love, like the video. Subscribe to the channel, not for me, but for the voices still waiting to be heard. Because sometimes the war doesn't end when the guns go silent. Sometimes the war ends when someone listens and finally says, "I hear you."